Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's session is titled The Politics and Culture of Inequality Since the 1970s. And our lead scholar, our guest tonight, is Jefferson Cowie from Vanderbilt University. My name is Andy Mink. I am the Vice President of Education at the Center, and I know that all of us are completely fried and tired of talking into microphones and looking at screens. I really do appreciate you taking some time from the rest of your day to join us in this webinar. It's important for us to be able to not only address these topics and to be able to bring you resources and content and conversations that you can use in your classroom, but it seems like this might be even more relevant now that you're likely and largely teaching online. And although Joel up in Illinois claims that the curriculum's all made up now and the grades don't matter, and while that may be true to some degree, I hope that what we can infuse in your thinking about this topic and the ways that your kids interact with it might be helpful. I want to thank, as I always do, Libby Taylor and Mike Williams for their help in the Education Programs Department. Libby's our primary contact and point of contact with our scholars. She helps develop the PowerPoints and collect the readings, and she also helps manage any interest or any concern you might have on your end. So please do reach out to us if you need any help now that things have gone a little bit sideways and the administration of your professional development might be a little bit more complicated. And Mike Williams runs our online courses. If you have any questions or interest in registering for our online courses, please do reach out to Mike. The center, like virtually everywhere, is closed right now. We had to send all of our fellows home. We actually closed probably about a week before COVID-19 really took over our world and our culture, primarily because we have international scholars and they needed to get out of the country and get back to their homes. Even though the building's closed, even though we're working remotely, even though our fellows have returned to their home campuses and lives, you can still have access to all of our content through our website. And I would encourage you to explore that website, potentially find material that you can use in your classroom and your teaching. It may be that some of that material is also helpful for your students. So for example, if you go to our search function and you're interested in other and additional material that might support what you're going to discuss tonight with Dr. Cowie, you might type in Nixon, for example, and quickly pull up a recording of a webinar we did just a few years ago with Kent Germany from the University of South Carolina. He focused on the declassified secret White House tapes and explored presidential power. And so by going to our website, you can use that search function to find keywords and searchable and the indexable materials that we have. And many of these might be appropriate for your students. Tonight's session will be recorded. It will be posted within the next day or so. And again, if you like to assign that or ask your students to listen to part of it, it seems to be, might be a good way for particularly your older students to interact with this material. A couple of quick announcements and reminders. Our Teacher Advisory Council is currently accepting applications for the 2021 school year, academic year. We've extended the deadline to May the 22nd, partly because we do ask that you get a letter of support from your immediate supervisor or administrator or building principal. The reason we do that, by the way, is that we want them on board when we bring you to North Carolina next fall for a 2-day summit and retreat. And so if they write you that letter of reference in advance and they outline that they understand what the commitments and the responsibilities will be, then it's much easier for you to get that time off when the fall rolls around. Please do consider joining the Teacher Advisory Council, particularly if you attend many of our webinars, you've attended some of our summer programs like Brianna Holtz. We'd love to have your participation and your contributions through the year of tenure. I mentioned our online courses. Our next suite of courses will launch on May the 26th, so we're currently accepting registrations. We have 3 courses that will run at the end of May. All of these courses have been approved and pre-approved in many states and districts. That includes Los Angeles Unified, so if you're in LA and you'd like to take a course and earn up to 35 hours, which equals 1 salary point, please do consider registering for those courses. And finally, I also want to remind you that we will be hosting our Teacher Institute. We've switched the dates to the end of July in hopes of the world being somewhat back to an open state. We'll be working with A.D. Carson, professor of music from the University of Virginia, on a session titled Beyond February. the African American experience in hip hop. So we'd love to have any of you join us for that. Again, you'd come to the center, come to Durham for 5 days at the end of July. A couple of reminders about tonight's session. As many of you know, this is an audio only session, so you'll hear our voices and you'll see an associated PowerPoint that will drive the conversation, but your participation is still super helpful and important. And that primarily happens through the chat box, the one that I'm seeing many of you introduce yourself and share where you're from. Please do use that chat box to share ideas, URLs, questions. As the moderator, I'll bring those questions to Dr. Cowie and we'll address them as best we can. But please do use that to not only interact with us, but to interact with each other. And by the end of the session, you'll be able to grab that, the chat history, if you like, if there's some URLs or some resources that you'd like to share. Really pleased to be able to welcome Jefferson Cowie to our program tonight. Although he is a professor of history at Vanderbilt University, it's my understanding he's actually in California right now. And so he's on the same time zone as many of our participants. Jeff, I'm going to unmute you and introduce you. It's funny, everything is alphabetized by first names, which always fools me. There you are, Jeff. Hey, Jeff, can you hear me? Jeff, let's turn your microphone on. There you go. Hey, Jeff.
Hey.
Hey, thanks for joining us.
Hello, everybody.
I can hear you just fine. I've given you mouse and control of the PowerPoint. We're very anxious to spend some time with you tonight discussing this topic. And as I mentioned, as the moderator, I'll be bringing you questions from these teachers who are, again, located all over the country. Before we get started, I'd actually like to ask you a question just to sort of frame the night, if you don't mind. You know, just from the topic and from the ways that the title of the session, it led me to ask to think of this question. At Vanderbilt, you're working with kids that many of these teachers taught a year ago, 2 years ago. When you work with your students at Vanderbilt, is it difficult to teach what seems to be systems? You know, so often history is sort of constructed around biographies or dates or timelines, but inequality, that's a pretty complicated system. How do you approach that in your own teaching? Do you find that students struggle with that?
That's a great question, because it also speaks a little bit to how I think, as I think you're all about to find out. But I teach a class called Capital, Labor, and Democracy, and it sort of combines a little bit of history of capitalism, business history, labor history, social history, and trying to sort of see how that individual biography you just mentioned sort of fits in these larger macroeconomic patterns, and what the relationship is between democratic participation and those big structures. And so if you can sort of hook them in with those stories, with those individuals, and then embed it in those larger questions, it has a really nice resonance for them. One of our most popular majors actually is a combination of economics and history. So, but don't worry, there won't be much economics tonight.
Yeah, it's interesting the way you describe that, though, because again, it also implies the interdisciplinary approach that you're taking. So you're an historian who's also working in sort of these other fields simultaneously. What are those other fields? Is our folks tonight sort of consider the lens that you're using? History is certainly one, economics is one, and there's some subfields, social history, political history likely. Are there other disciplines that you think would be particularly appropriate for approaching this topic?
Well, it's funny you should say that, because I'm here at Stanford right now. Well, like you guys, we had to evacuate, but I'm still in Palo Alto. But I'm at a place called the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences, where there's a couple of historians and mostly sociologists and political scientists and economists and the rest. So I really enjoy the interdisciplinary setting, even though it brings out my sort of disciplinary backbone all the time. I'm like, this is really how we need to understand the world is change over time. But if you can take that idea of change over time and you can apply it to a variety of different approaches to thinking, and one of my favorite things to do, and I'll spice this up a little bit tonight, is think about how popular culture works, how movies and television shows and music fits into some of these trends as well, because so that's another aspect of what I really like to do.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for answering those questions. And again, you've got a an audience tonight that really does span grade level and discipline, and we're anxious to hear this story. So the mouse is yours, and we're looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Great, Andy. Well, thanks a lot, everybody. Thanks for showing up to yet another online presentation that we're all probably sick to death of at this point. But I'll try to keep it as interesting as I possibly can. And the chance to do this is a real treat and a real honor, and it makes me think of Mr. Pico, who was my history teacher in high school, in Crystal Lake Central High School in Illinois, who really was the first one who ever got up there and just made me super excited about the past, and I carry him with me to this day. So I appreciate all the work you guys are doing out there.
I really wish that I could say that he's in the audience right now. Wouldn't that be a nice move, Jeff, to sort of bring him forward?
It would actually be a minor miracle because unfortunately Mr. Pico is no longer with us. But I did, when I got tenure though, I wrote him a really nice letter and said,
that's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, we had a good correspondence. Okay, so what I want to do tonight is talk about how the politics of inequality work more or less since 1945, with an emphasis increasingly sort of more emphasis as we move toward the present. But I want to, and I'm going to throw a few graphs and charts in there at the beginning, but don't worry. Hopefully they're just sort of to be impressionistic. There will be a quiz on any sort of econometrics here. But let's begin with, there we go, okay, good. This picture, which is actually on the cover of my second book, Staying Alive, was taken in 1970, in May of 1970, at what were known as the Hard Hat Riots. They happened more or less every Friday throughout the month of May. And I think it captures a great deal about what is coming in the ensuing decades. This is what one, the National Review called Country and Western Marxism, or other people call Marxism in reverse, which was the working class out in the streets demanding basically all power to the establishment. This was in favor of Richard Nixon. This was against Mayor Lindsay, who was seen as too liberal. It was in favor of the war. It was against the hippies. It was in favor of the family and tradition and hard work and all of these sort of things. And this is sort of, I think, the beginning of a sort of image of what blue-collar, white working class America was. Prior to this, it was a sort of the working class hero of the New Deal period, who was embedded in the Democratic Party and the union structure and all this sort of stuff. But now what we begin to see is the white working class moving towards the forefront of the culture wars. And Richard Nixon sees this and sees this moment and really mobilizes a great deal of political energy and ideas, and has the leader of the building trades in New York City down to the White House and all this to sort of really capitalize on this hard hat revolt. And in fact, he won a majority of the white working class vote in that election. It really, in the 72 election against McGovern, and it really sort of crystallized what this new being was going to be. So that's my opening kind of idea that we'll move forward from. I want to back up though and look at why we should care about inequality. Andy asked about my students, and this is how one of the ways I hook them. I said, we'll get into a philosophical debate. Should we care whether inequality exists or not? And one answer is no. As long as nobody's starving or the bottom's not falling out of the economy, then why should we care about inequality? Well, I think this chart helps us with this. On the vertical axis is an index of bad things or potentially bad things. limits on life expectancy, math and literacy, infant mortality, homicides, imprisonment, teenage births, trust, obesity, these things. And you go from better outcomes to worse outcomes as you go vertically. And down at the bottom axis, we go from low income inequality to high. And you can place these countries on a spectrum. So you see a direct relationship between how unequal a society is and the negative social outcomes of inequality, which it's a very complex mechanism how that happens. But so we see down here in the lower part, can you see my cursor? I don't know.
Yeah, we can see your cursor.
Okay, you can see it. So down here, we see the more social democratic countries where inequality is lower and we have lower negative outcomes. And then we move our way up. And then if you go way up here, you see this extreme outlier of amongst the highest inequality in the developed world and the worst social outcomes in the developed world. So even life expectancy for rich people is lower in unequal countries. So my opening argument, and I sort of, if you look in the upper left-hand corner up here, you'll see that I have a series of arguments I'm going to try and lay out. My first argument is about the nature of post-war inequality. So you can follow along with those numbered arguments. But my first sort of claim is that inequality is a central question for politics and culture and social life. And in the United States, it's particularly complicated and extreme in terms of both social outcomes and inequality itself. So if we look at the post-war era, and we'll look at the shape of this curve, that's all you have to worry about. It goes from 1910 up to 2012 or so. And most of the graphs you look at inequality start right here, somewhere around 1970 or so, and say, oh my gosh, look at how much the share of annual income earned by the top 1% has gone up. In other words, the top 1% is sharp elbows at the bargaining table of America and is taking more and more wealth. But what we tend not to look at is the backstory. Let's looking backward, go all the way back to 1910. Now we have a very different kind of graph where we have this period followed by this really kind of odd period, and then a return to kind of what might be thought of as a unfortunate norm of inequality. So down here we have really low inequality, up here high inequality, and then a return to high inequality. So I want to make the argument that, and this is a little bit different than most people are going to argue, and we can talk about this. What most people look at is, hey, what caused this spike in inequality? And what I look at is, hey, what caused this weird period down here where we didn't have inequality, where it had relatively low equality, where relatively high equality in incomes and wealth.
Before you move on, Jeff, before you move on, I want to bring a comment to you, and it may be that these last two graphs are something that you can contextualize this, and it's impossible not to bring this up in a way. Rashida Smith notes that we're seeing this right now with COVID-19 pandemic. The people on the bottom are holding up the entire country. In the United States, inequality continues and it hasn't changed for the better. How do you place the graphs, the data you just presented in the most contemporary of contexts?
Yeah, well, if we go back to this one, I mean, what we're going to see is the societies that are best prepared for this will have the distance between the top and the bottom of the economy tend to have stronger safety nets, better healthcare systems, and things like this than those further up the range. So I think what we're going to see is absolutely correct what the commenter said, which is that we're going to kind of the burdens will be socialized at the bottom of the economy rather than the top. And I think but the problem with just saying that though is it actually creates a toxic social environment and political environment for everybody. And I'm gonna sort of get to that if we, when we get to the end of the talk.
Sure.
But but I think I was just thinking about this graph, looks very different now with the COVID a crisis. We're, as a country, because of federalism and individualism and a whole host of other variables, proving fairly ineffective, I think, in fighting this thing. And in some ways is probably also a harbinger to our capacity to fight global warming as well.
Yeah. And then one more question about this graph. This comes from Connor Kaplan. I believe Connor's in Los Angeles, just down the one from you. If this graph is saying anything, we will see a drop in the coming years, most likely due to a recession or a depression. Can you sort of fast forward this graph to look at the future?
Every historian I know quips, we do the past, not the future. You know, I've been speculating a lot with my friends and colleagues about what this means, and I essentially think that ultimately we do not know. You know, at any place in the last 12 months, if anybody said they knew what was going to happen politically or in terms of public health or anything, they would have been wrong. Arguably the last 4 years. So all bets are off, but I do think that we are in a moment of reconfiguration of the overall political economy. And I think the Sanders campaign is part of that. The Trump presidency is part of that. There's a lot of variables being scrambled right now. The COVID virus is doubling down on that. And I think what direction it all goes remains to be seen, and what sort of demands are placed upon the system.
Great, thank you.
Great question, and I wish I could tell you, you know, exactly what's going to happen, but I just can't. One of the key figures or features of this post-war period, this is the same axis, but the vertical axis here is union density, and so again, we tend to see graphs that start somewhere around 1970 or 1980 and say, oh, look at the decline of union density. But what we don't look at is, well, again, we have this weirdo period right in the middle here between the mid 30s and the late 70s that I've called the Great Exception, in which you have this rather dramatic peak in union power. And that means political power, it means economic power, it means distribution of wealth. There's a whole bunch of reasons for that I can get into, but we probably don't have time to go. And even here's another factor. This is measures of party polarization. This is how much the Republicans hate the Democrats and how much the Democrats hate the Republicans. So you have a high degree of party polarization. Then you have this weird era of sort of fairly good feelings in the post-war era from the 30s to the 70s, and then it goes back up. And what's interesting actually for the House metric, the guy who developed this regarded 1.0 as perfect party animosity. He now measures it at 1.2. So we have exceeded perfection in how much party hatred and animosity there is. But what we see here is, again, this middle period that stands out. And I keep thinking about this with, I wrote the book on this before Donald Trump came out, but the Make America Great slogan sort of speaks to this golden age of American politics and capitalism, the post-war era. And so there's two arguments on why this period might be thought of as that golden age. One is wages were going up, job stability was high, industry was powerful, the whole thing. And the other darker version of that would be that it's also the era of Jim Crow and segregation and traditional family, quote unquote, values. And I think both of those may play a role in what the Make America Great rhetoric is about. But what I want to make the argument is that when we're thinking about this period, we have a very complicated era to think about because, and I'm just going to waltz through this, that period, what I'm calling here the New Deal order right here in the middle, is a unique period in American history. I've sketched out, and I do this, this is a 250-page book, but here it is in one graph. You have a pre-New Deal period. You have the New Deal order from the 30s to the 70s. It's what the French call the Trente Glorieuses, the glorious 30 years. And then the post-New Deal era, or our own time. And I think the 70s are really the roots of our own time. But what you see here in this period is a very unique moment where, for instance, if we think about the variable of race, the Democratic, prior to the New Deal, it's essentially a segregated system, but it's politicized around that segregation. In the middle period, you have this kind of transition period where the Democrats are both engaging with the with the segregationist South, but also bringing in African American voters at the same time. So you have this sort of mixed transition period until the post 70s, and we'll talk about that, where it's really about the politics of inclusion, but that means you have this political rejiggering of the South that I'm going to talk about more in a minute. Immigration is probably the easiest one to grasp because basically the country is defined by immigration prior to 1924, but from 1924 to 1965, there's essentially very, very little immigration that allows a sort of homogeneity to be kind of forced upon the society. And now we're back to a more divisive politics of immigration. So this is a problematic thing because I think immigration is great for the culture and the economy, yet there's this irony that it was a more equitable political economy when there was limited immigration, solely because we were fighting less about who's an American and more about how to distribute the pie. Same with individualism. Hoover gave the rugged individualism speech right before the stock market collapsed in 1929. It was very powerful. And then in the New Deal order, it's very checked by both the Great Depression, where we're all in this together, the Cold War period, where we have the sense of we're all in this together. And then in the 70s and 80s, you see this revived individualism both on the right and the left. On the right, very much in a sort of Austrian economic individualism kind of thing, and on the left, a sort of rights-conscious politics that's very different than the collective bargaining of the post-war period. Similar with the culture wars, I mean, we think of the culture wars as, questions over religion and values and all these things as something very new. But actually, in the 19th century, early 20th century, from the Scopes trial to prohibition, all these things, they defined American politics. Well, from the 30s to the 70s, you had this sort of truce, partially a Cold War thing, partially a product of the Great Depression, World War II mobilization, where people more or less agreed on norms. And then, of course, in the 70s and 80s, this explodes into questions about the family, questions about abortion rights, questions about what's proper behavior, dress, all sorts of gender, gay rights. All these things become central in politics. Moving down to class and labor. That's probably the most obvious one. I showed you that graph, where unions are pretty much impossible to organize prior to the New Deal. They are legitimate but contained from the 30s to the 70s, and then they get this sort of much more repressive system in the 80s and beyond. So again, we have this unique situation in this period where this golden age is really interesting, but it's going to be really hard to get back to because it's a questionable model for our own time, given how unique the political culture was. And the state, finally, very strong pro-business up through the Gilded Age and through the 1920s. And then the state plays a much more aggressive role in redistribution of wealth from the New Deal through the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson until it reverts back to kind of a strongly pro-business perspective under Reagan. So my argument here is, if we sum this all up, the post-war era was a unique moment in American history because the political culture worked in a very different way, creating a sort of homogenized culture that allowed a kind of more social democratic politics to emerge. There's sort of an axiom in political science that says the more homogeneous a political polity is, the more likely it is to be a social democratic country. So think about Scandinavia is very homogeneous. The United States is very diverse. And it's hard to share when in diverse, when your polity is particularly diverse. So this is an era, this New Deal order period, in which we were more, there was more sense of shared, not necessarily in good ways. For instance, I would say immigration exclusion, most obviously.
We've got a quick question back from your graph, Jeff. This
Great.
comes
Should I go back?
If you don't mind, thanks. This comes from Suzanne Burton. She asks, was there a defining event that sparked the New Age changes in 1978-ish, or was it the crescendo from the equality movements of the 60s and early 70s? Was there something in that 1978 that made it flip from New Deal order to post-New Deal order?
Right, what a great question. And I think you should be suspicious of any sort of pinpoint date. Yeah. I think I could put 1974 there, the oil crisis. I could put 1978 because of a host of political issues. You could put 1981 when Ronald Reagan became president. It's really true historical change is a very slurry, slushy kind of thing. It doesn't just happen on one day. So it's almost an arbitrary year within a number of years I could have selected. And when I do better presentations and make that or more elaborate presentations on this question, I make that clearer. The 60s question is really interesting because there's two things that come out of the 1960s. One is sort of the new politics of inclusion, right? The civil rights movement, the women's movement, and all the rest that are saying, hey, we were left out of that original bargain in the 30s and 40s. Let us in now. And so the politics of including these new people is kind of what rips it apart. It's so fragile and so white and so male that it actually can't withstand, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, can't really withstand further demands on it from the calls for inclusion that come out of the 1960s. And I'd also make the argument that not all the protest movements, but certainly the way they got connected into politics tended to be much more individualistic. So we're back here to this question of individualism. You have a revived individualism. So for instance, think about in the New Deal era, it was about the National Labor Relations Act. And if you had a complaint, you joined a union and you collectively demanded better wages and working conditions. After the 60s, that was on the wane. What was on the rise was the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And if you had a complaint, it was an individual complaint, and you brought it to a government bureaucracy and say, I'm being discriminated against. Can you help me solve this? Which is extremely important, but a very different model, right? Great, very insightful question.
Yeah, thanks, Suzanne. And I wonder too, as you look at this, and it's so helpful to be able to draw sort of macro conclusions and put it into a chart like this. If we were to peel this back, Jeff, could you also make certain geographic conclusions? In other words, were any of these happening more quickly or more deeply in regions of the country? The Deep South, certainly in the New Deal order, or the Northeast or the West Coast. I mean, does it really parse itself out by geography?
Yes, very much so, Andy. So labor liberalism, for lack of a better term, that post-war model is particularly strong in the Northeast, parts of the major cities of the Midwest, and all along the Pacific Coast. The New Deal paradigm never really busted out of those limitations. So the South and much of the Rocky Mountain West never quite got incorporated into that New Deal model as strongly as those other areas did. And race played an enormous role in that, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit.
And that also implies then that of those categories, the rows that you have, some of them had more influence on this overall model than others.
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure.
Right. Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to talk more about specifically about race in a minute. So I think I've been very sort of concerned about the kind of the white working class problem in America as of late, for obvious reasons, I think, and what happened to the white working class. I mean, we spent a lot of time, as we should, on civil rights and women's rights and gay rights and all these things, and I am 100% on board. However, the problem right now is actually, I think, a different constituency, is what happened to the politics of white working class people. And so we went from this sort of, they were embedded in this sort of union democratic system, and I showed you that slide from the 1970 Hard Hat protests, to kind of this loose variable in American politics. And I call this the Three George problem of the early 1970s. And that is, it's not that we saw the white working class kind of go wholesale one direction or another. No, it went in multiple directions. So it fragments. The first we see over here on the left, although he should be on the right politically, is George Wallace, the segregationist governor of Alabama, who ran for president in 68, 72, well, and 76 as well. But really made his big stand in 72 under a Stand Up for America agenda, very populist, against the state, against the direction that liberalism was going, the sort of reactionary populist. He, in a lot of ways, stages, I think, Donald Trump in important ways. The second George in the middle is George McGovern, who ironically was a labor historian, wrote his PhD in labor history, which I guess that's what I did my PhD in as well, suggesting perhaps the failure of labor history. But George McGovern ran against Richard Nixon, of course, and represented kind of this a white working class that was open to the women's movement, open to the anti-war movement, open to the civil rights movement, much more capacious than those. And then finally on the right is the third George, George Meany, head of the American Federation of Labor, Congress of Industrial Organizations, AFL-CIO, the old cigar chomping, hardcore, tough, bull-nosed kind of collective bargaining version that nothing matters besides the economic rights of workers. Well, the George Meany version is doomed. Union density when he started was about 36% of all workers now in the private sector. Now it's probably a little more than 6% in the private sector. And the George McGovern part is still very strong within, I would say, the Democratic Party. But the George Wallace part is really, I think, in many ways the key, because Nixon learns from Wallace, Reagan learns from Nixon and Wallace, and certainly I think Donald Trump did as well. And this becomes a really powerful variable in this sort of fragmentation of the white working class vote and the drift rightward, really. So this is a flyer I found in the Nixon and the McGovern papers, excuse me. You know, which is just sort of this astounding or incredulous kind of question: how in the hell can you vote for Nixon? And here's the kind of classic George Meany and George Wallace kind of voters just saying, how can you do that? And because this was a new and sort of unprecedented direction for workers to be sort of these right-wing figures in a way they hadn't been before. And I just point out a little fun things you can get in the archives here. Up here on the right-hand side, this is written on the one I found. It says, Rosemary, I printed 10,000 for distribution in Hialeah, Florida. Hialeah, Florida at the time was George Wallace territory in 1972. So this was specifically, we're going after the Wallace vote at this point. And when McGovern ran in 72, he said, I could not believe the support that Wallace was getting in the factories all over the country, wherever he went. It was really astounding to him how powerful that was. So to sort of summarize where we're at, we had the post-war era where there was a relatively low levels of inequality based on a sort of precarious political homogeneity in the post-war period. That begins to fall apart in the 60s. The white working class becomes up for grabs a little bit. Then we have all the crises of the 1970s. They just come in and just hammer and hammer and hammer and hammer. So, whoops, I have a very, pardon me, I have a
You're excited
delay.
about those three arguments.
So the first is a major economic crisis, which we know as stagflation, which was unemployment plus inflation. Now, if you know anything about basic economics, these are supposed to be opposite. When one goes up, the other goes down, and you're supposed to be able to regulate an economy. Do you want more unemployment? You're willing to face inflation. You know, you can do this trade-off. Well, now both variables are going up, and this hamstrings the Democratic Party. They don't know how to respond to this problem because it used to be, well, let's get another government program going, and that will help take care of unemployment. Well, if you do that, then you're going to push up inflation, and now we're going to be in trouble. So this just sort of becomes a major shock to the Democrats' capacity to set an agenda and to lead in the 1970s. This is connected to, and but also somewhat separate to, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, who essentially created a cartel of oil producers and starved the United States of oil, creating two oil shocks in the 1970s that, again, also just rattled the economy and really the culture to its core. Because, I mean, this is a nation of believes in automobiles. Right now, we're running out of gas. I mean, it's a metaphor and it's a reality, and that's a sort of shaking the nation to its foundations, I would say, in an important way. I throw in the fall of Saigon in 1975. I mean, essentially, this is a blow to the U.S.'s ability to think about itself as a superpower. The United States basically lost a war to, you know, what Lyndon Johnson called a pissant country, and both the fall of Saigon and the pulling out the troops 2 years earlier was really quite a stunning blow to the psyche of who we are as a country and who we were in the world. Both OPEC and Saigon together suggested we're no longer in charge of the world in the way that we once were. Similar trade and deindustrialization. Everybody, including organized labor, was in favor of trade in the post-war era, free trade. But in the 70s, that began to turn around for a couple of reasons. One, the rest of the world caught up after the devastation of World War II. You know, nobody was suddenly Japanese electronics and German automobiles were a thing, and they were competing with American goods. And the other was the development of export processing zones in the developing world. Suddenly, you know, Mexico and Taiwan and Puerto Rico launched export processing zones that could compete with American production. And now those great jobs that sort of define the post-war era were falling apart. And then, especially in terms of the Democrats' ability to sort of stake a claim on leadership, the Iranian hostage crisis, I think, played a similar role in this kind of shattering of confidence about who we were as a nation. You know, this revolutionary Islamic regime is sort of holding the nation captive for hundreds of days. And if you just take this all together, you have these crises that are very difficult to figure your way out of, and really signals, as somebody asked, why 1978? Well, if you kind of put all these together, you begin to see, you know, it's around 78 that all of this takes place. But what happens in 1978 is a series of political initiatives that I really won't go into because it'll bore you even more than I'm boring you now, in which the Democrats try to sort of regain the initiative through a series of political actions on full employment, labor law reform, national health insurance, things like this that all kind of fall apart in 1978. And then that opens up leadership from the right quite powerfully, because the conservative solution is be powerful abroad and discipline the economy, as Reagan will say, just will wring the inflation out of the economy by driving up unemployment.
Jeff, I'm struck that maybe on purpose and maybe just the function of tonight's talk, that was the first time you had mentioned conflict or war. Where do you position sort of, you know, World War II, Korea, Vietnam? How do these things, they're more than backdrops, certainly, but is that an assumption in the argument you're making, or is that an implied factor as well?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of an assumption. I mean, World War II played an extraordinarily important role, obviously, in creating that post-war settlement that I was talking about. And a lot of people will say, oh, well, it was just World War II. But no, it's actually the New Deal programs plus the recovery of World War II. Right. You know, we had a recovery after World War I that fell into a depression. But with those redistributive programs of the New Deal, plus the economic recovery of World War II, it played a really important role, as well as the sense of victory culture, we're in this together, that happened in World War II, which of course fragments on Vietnam. We're not in this together anymore. This is a divisive moment. And as you saw in the very first slide of the Hard Hat Revolt, that's coming out in favor of the war and against the anti-war protesters, this plays the opposite role that World War II does.
Great, thank you.
Great question. So one of my favorite things about the 1970s, and I have many favorite things about the 1970s, is the crisis of confidence speech of Jimmy Carter, and I think I put that in the readings. It's also worth watching. And here's a young person I love this picture. He's watching the television while somebody's pumping gas and drinking a Dr. Pepper. It's sort of perfect, because what Carter's crisis of confidence speech was about was encouraging people to stop buying things and look for a more spiritual dimension to life. But how did this come about? So what I want to use this to talk about is the Democrats' inability, or at least Carter's inability, to find a cohesive vision that equaled that of FDR, Truman, Johnson, who can all sort of be seen as sort of linked together in a kind of, even and Eisenhower as well. He's working within that paradigm, the post-war period. So Carter's supposed to give an energy speech, and suddenly he disappears, and nobody knows where he's at, and everybody's freaking out. And where he was up at Camp David, and actually flying around to certain locations on the East Coast, meeting with people, trying to figure out what the heck to do about the state of the nation. And this is what you see over here on the right-hand side, is the seating plan for one of the many dinners he had with leading intellectuals and politicians and writers who he thought could help him figure this out. And it's a fascinating, I mean, just this one table, if we start at the over on the top right, we see Jesse Jackson, who's at the time is running Operation Push, People United to Save Humanity, would later run for president. Phil Moyers, the famous journalist, Jimmy Carter. Daniel Bell, famous sociologist who started out at Fortune magazine and then wrote The Coming Post-Industrial Society and The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. And then at the bottom, Charles Peters, who started the Washington Monthly. Then going up, Patrick Cadell, who's this pollster whose idea this whole thing really was. Haynes Johnson, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. Mrs. Carter, Christopher Lasch, who's The Culture of Narcissism had come out and really shaped the sort of world of thinking in the 1970s, basically working in tandem with Tom Wolfe's famous essay called The Me Decade in New York Magazine, essentially saying we've become self-absorbed, narcissistic people who can't sort of escape our own bubble. And then finally, the novelist John Gardner. And so, you know, especially when you think about the anti-intellectual environment we're in now, this is a rather kind of, I think, kind of sort of stunning thing where a president takes 10 days out of his life and just sits down with all these people and thinks about where things should go. And it's called the Crisis of Confidence speech, where he just essentially gives up and gives sort of a sermon to the nation, saying that they need to stop worshiping things and buying things and look at spiritual values. And it worked at first, and then it kind of went down as one of the great flops of American political rhetoric. And it, in a lot of ways, sort of symbolizes the inability of the Democratic Party to deal with these questions of rising inequality in the 70s and the fragmentation of politics.
So if I could ask for just a clarifying comment on that.
Sure.
You mentioned that it was taken relatively well at the beginning, and then it became increasingly seen as a flop. How did that happen? Was it that the initial response in the public, in the media, et cetera? I mean, I could have been this kid right here with the Dr. Pepper, so I wasn't watching it.
Yeah, give me both.
But what were the metrics for success versus flop then?
Right. So the polling right after the speech was pretty high. They felt he did a good job. Many people criticized him because this actually didn't have a programmatic or a policy or even an economic core. It was more sort of a come to Jesus sort of meeting where you're supposed to find your inner self. Nonetheless, it did do well. And then the next day, he made an enormous mistake, and he fired everybody in his cabinet. And this is after, just a number of years after Watergate, which I could have added to the list of the 70s. And at that point, when he fired, he basically fired everybody, had them reapply for their jobs, gave a bunch of them back to them. But it looked to the public that this was just a mean-spirited move, very Washington kind of thing to do. And he essentially lost all the momentum that he got from the speech, which to me suggests that the momentum from the speech was not really powerful, actually, to begin with. I think it was a little thin.
So one of our attendees, somebody in our audience tonight, Bonnie Belshi, who actually is in Cupertino, just down the street from you, notes that she plays this speech for her students without telling them about the backlash, and then asks for their evaluation of it. And Bonnie, I'm wondering if you can put in the chat box the kinds of impressions your students have when they listen to the speech cold without the context of what happens before or after, particularly as they see it with the 2020 lens. And then I wonder, Jeff, if you play this for your students in Vanderbilt and how they respond to that particular primary source speech.
Yeah, I play it all the time.
How do your kids respond to it?
I would say it's actually lacking in. Well, I'd be more curious to hear what the teachers get from their students. From my students, they get a fairly cynical spin.
Bonnie says that they're very impressed and feel it had an emotional connection.
Oh, that's great. Okay, maybe my students are a little more jaded. I also don't give it contextless. I say, here's the crisis of the 70s, it's a mess, and here's the answer. So they might have higher expectations by the time I offer the setup. But I think some people are like, yeah, wow, he really laid out, we need to be energy independent and we need to buy less stuff. And, that's a pretty powerful message that I think a lot of students today would go, yeah, that's exactly right. But I think most of my students sort of see it more as a little thin, a little shallow approach. And they love it when he pounds the table, though. There's this part where he actually pounds the table in sort of almost in a way that like Pat Cadell said, pound the table at this particular point. It seems rehearsed. But the question, I think, of the crisis of confidence speech, though, is, you have a generation, if you think about those guys who are the Hard Hat Revolt, right? They're generation and a half out of poverty. They just arrived. There's kind of a lot of unnecessary consumerism, especially in an inflationary time. But it's hard to say. You've got too much stuff. The whole post-war boom was predicated on you get lots of stuff if you play the game right. And he didn't necessarily offer the trade-off. He implied that it would be spiritual enrichment and a better nation, but I'm not sure he offered an adequate argument to what the America of his imagination could be, especially from a policy perspective, rather than just an individual behavior perspective.
Great, thank you.
So this opens up the path, for Ronald Reagan, and Reagan had ran really almost won in some ways in 1976 for the primary against Gerald Ford, and many people thought he should have won. But here was the opportunity for two key things, I think. One, he is not responsible to urban and labor groups, so he can wring inflation out of the economy and destroy this stagflation monster that's been plaguing the nation. And the other thing he can do is essentially he's a Cold War hawk, and he's willing to push back and to say America's back, the costs be damned, the lessons of Vietnam be damned, we're back in the saddle. And he's even a cowboy of sorts. So it was it seems to me that sort of, he actually makes reference to the crisis of confidence speech in his inaugural. There is no crisis of confidence. This is the greatest nation on earth, and that has a tremendous resonance. Not that I understood it at the time, but I very, very clearly do in retrospect. And of course, one of his first actions was in the summer of 1981 when the professional air traffic controllers went on strike. He said, you go back to work or you're fired. And 11,000 of them did not go back to work and were fired. And we're not just fired, but we're permanently replaced and their leaders taken away in chains. And it's really signaled to the private sector that, okay, you can now work without unions. And so a spree of union busting happened in the 1980s, and that helped further through deregulation, breaking of unions, and things like that. It A, got rid of inflation, but B, began this age of inequality that we live in today. And that's sort of the roots of the inequality of our time. And I think, you know, there's lots of ways to think about this. And in my book, Staying Alive, I spend a few chapters looking at popular culture and how all this plays out, you know. And if you want to look at kind of the early kind of white working class complexities about where they're going, you can look at like this movie, Peter Boyle movie, Joe, or All in the Family, of course. Or this nostalgia for the 1950s that you already see in the 70s through Happy Days or American Graffiti, or this kind of white working class people fighting back that you see in like Rocky or Saturday Night Fever, this Paul Schrader movie, Blue Collar, or even Norma Ray, the great movie about the Roanoke Rapids organizing and J.P. Stevens. And I think most obviously with Reagan, Wall Street, with Michael Douglas, and the famous Greed is Good speech, in which you really sort of see the resolution of a lot of the churn of the 1970s.
A couple of questions before you move on, Jeff. One of them is from Joshua Sensenbaugh. He asks, how does community leadership play a role in this psychological transformation?
What a wonderful question. You know, there's a pretty good book by Mike Foley called Front Porch Politics. And he makes the argument actually that politics moves from the national stage to the community level. That is a pretty compelling argument, actually. So if you look at some of the great things, great causes of the decade, say it's like the Love Canal crisis in New York, you know, with the toxic waste problems and things like this. These are struggles that are happening on a community level, which are really important. But what that means is a sort of new communitarianism sacrifices state and federal activism in a way. But it's a very realistic turn, I think, after many of the disappointments of federal politics, whether it's, you know, Watergate or Vietnam or whatever the case may be. So I do think actually, if you want to see where the action is, it is on that community level. Also for the right as well.
And then, one more question. This is from Ricardo Richards. I do want to note that Ricardo posted a link earlier in the chat box to an op-ed that he recently wrote about this topic. But Ricardo asks, did automation contribute to inequality, particularly as you look at the labor history here and the image on the right? How does automation factor into that?
Wow, great question. So, you know, if in 1964, if you were to poll industrial workers about the biggest problem facing the country, it wouldn't be Vietnam and it wouldn't be civil rights and anything like that. It would be automation. The idea that their jobs are going to be replaced by robots was very real. So this has been a continuous problem, I think, for a very long time. And there's a famous scene where the head of General Motors is bringing, I think it's the head of General Motors, is bringing Walter Reuther on a tour of the new mechanized auto plants. And he says, Walter Reuther's the head of the United Auto Workers. And he says, look, Walter, look at these new robots. They don't go on strike. And Walter Reuther says, yeah, they won't buy your cars either. And you know, I think that's another element of this you see falling apart is this kind of Fordist pact, a high wage, high demand economy is very different once you hit this global scale where you can now sell to a global middle class, and you don't necessarily depend upon the demand from the lower echelons. So automation can take place sort of with a certain amount of impunity as long as there's a global economy, which may be changing as we speak.
Great,
but there are countries, and we'll talk about this a little bit at the end, there are countries that are doing a better job with the questions of automation than we are. So I'm always a little, whenever people say it's globalization or automation, I'm always aware that other countries are dealing with those questions more effectively. And we can go back to that first public health chart that I laid up with regard to that. Okay, so now, on top of all this, now we're going to go back to this regional question, Andy, that you asked about. And this is happening in the background of everything else we just talked about. Up until the 80s, well, this really actually begins as back to the other person's question, 78. 78 to 82, this really shifts quite dramatically, but then accelerates. The United States essentially has 4 political parties. They're under 2 labels, the Republicans and the Democrats, but each of those parties is divided into 2. So you have the liberal Republicans, represented here by Nelson Rockefeller, up here on the left, conservative Republicans, represented by Barry Goldwater, down here on the left. Up on the right, the Dixiecrats, or the Southern Democrats, the segregationist wing of the Democratic Party, represented by George Wallace, there in front of a Confederate flag, and the liberal Democrats, Lyndon Johnson, Hubert Humphrey. That's Hubert Humphrey. And what this means is there are shifting political alliances in which nothing happens without some deal making. And it may not just happen in sort of the red versus blue kind of logic that we have today, but you have a conservative coalition moving between the conservative Republicans and the Southern Democrats, and you have another kind of liberal alliance here between the liberal Democrats and the liberal Republicans. But you could also have it move within parties as well. What this means is you don't have the same dug-in political system that we have today. So just as all the inequality and is taking place, the old bargaining system of the party is crumbling. And what happens is that essentially the Southern Democrat, Southern Democrats, white Southern Democrats become Republicans. So that's combined there, and the liberal Republicans become liberal Democrats. And then you end up with 2 parties. And we're moving further and further away from any sort of parliamentary bargaining system, and now we're into what people call the era of polarization, in which you have this zero-sum political logic between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And as a result of the civil rights movement, as the South turns Republican, and then there's very little room within the Republican Party for liberals, so they become Democrats, you have a 2-party system essentially driven further and further apart, and partially tactically. That's why I have this picture of Newt Gingrich in the 1990s, in which he essentially regards it as his project to create a no holds barred, take no prisoners system. He will not tolerate any dissent within the Republican Party. There will not be any liberal Republicans. And the Democrats have lost a key part of their constituency, which was the South. So they're much more weakened. And the politics are now driving away from each other rather than this previous system that tended to breed more compromise. So it's interesting. Actually, more Republicans voted for the Civil Rights Act than Democrats, largely because of which is sort of something we don't think about, right? But now it's going apart, and we're at the point now where people are talking about negative partisanship. Negative partisanship isn't, I'm a Democrat, I stand for these things, or I'm a Republican, I stand for these things, but I hate the other guys. And so I'm essentially voting against them, not necessarily for anything. And this creates this sort of, along with the filibuster, a system that is essentially designed to not move. It's essentially gridlock on a whole nother level. And this is kind of where we find ourselves today.
One of the difficulties in thinking about systems is, for me at least, or perhaps for younger students, is it's difficult to figure out the cause and effect, where the levers are that
right.
sort of make one thing happen because something else did first. Suzanne Burton is asking, since the politics seem to be more extremist in both parties, I'm assuming she means today, might this be an opportune moment for an independent third party candidate to sweep for the middle? And so I'll tie that into my cause and effect comment. Is this an opportunity as you're describing it here?
Okay. Yeah, this is one of the problems with doing, an entire semester in 60 minutes. But, the simple cause and effect, if you want to go back to it, is really the civil rights movement. I mean, that's the crystallizing. So if you want to say this caused it, it's the reorientation of the South from solidly Democratic for 100 years or more, if you want to include the Jacksonian period, to the Republican Party. And it's that simple. If you look at the electoral map, that's really the cause. You go back and you look at the 64 race which Goldwater won. His conservative economic principles and libertarian approach really only won in the deep, deep South because they wanted the state off their back. So in order to not change the racial order. So that's the cause and effect. Now, back to this, the question about are both getting extreme. Prior to 2016, I would not say that both parties were heading toward the extremes. In fact, I think the Republican Party shifted quite dramatically to the right under Reagan and then Bush and then Bush. The Democratic Party actually, for all the rhetoric, if you look at what they're in favor of historically, especially since Clinton, again, prior to 2016, I think they've shifted to the right themselves. So what we've seen is a whole spectral shift to the right. I don't think the Democrats have been pushing very hard to the left. I mean, Clinton's famous tagline, "The era of big government is over," suggests as much, as does his signature piece of legislation, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was Ronald Reagan's idea. So I think the Democrats have been playing on the Republicans' field up until very, very recently. Now, the question, though, was, is this an opportunity for a third party? Third parties in America have traditionally and only rarely not played a spoiler role. Usually what it does is rob the party it's closest to of any chance of victory. And that's, so if, for instance, when Ross Perot ran in 1992, I think the evidence is a little murky, but he certainly made Clinton's victory more probable because he robbed the Republicans of votes. And certainly we saw that in 2000 when Ralph Nader ran and robbed Gore. Robbed, it's not a fair statement, but won votes that would have probably otherwise gone to Gore. I realize maybe those people didn't vote. I understand, wouldn't have voted, but But anyway, it tends to play a spoiler role. So this political system has been, or these two parties have been very, very durable. We haven't seen a new viable political party since the 1850s. But we have seen various attempts at third parties, the Bull-Moose Party, the Henry Wallace's People's Party, the American Independence Party under Wallace, the Dixiecrats, you know, a series of things. They tend to be flash in the pans, and they tend to throw the victory to the other side. Yeah. And that's not because they're inherently bad. It's because the winner-take-all constitutional structure that we inadvertently find ourselves. It's not the way they meant it to be, but it is the way it ended up being. It would be different if we were in a parliamentary system.
Right, thank you. And then to sort of follow up on that notion of this being an opportunity, Ricardo Richards asks, maybe this is less of an opportunity, more of a way to respond to circumstances. Ricardo asks, is a universal basic income part of the solution to inequality?
I'll tell you what, let's, I think, yeah, the UBI is, you know, for those of you who don't know, universal basic income, Andrew Yang ran on this. It's the idea that we, what used to be called a negative income tax, in fact, originally proposed under Nixon, and originally advocated by Milton Friedman, of all people, the conservative economist. So it has a long and rich history. It didn't come out of nowhere. I think it probably would, and we're essentially seeing what is close to UBI with these federal payments in the coronavirus crisis. I personally, my own politics tend toward more of a New Deal, have people do something in exchange for that money, because there's a lot of work to be done in the world. Not everybody can work, and certainly not everybody can work without childcare or healthcare, whatever the case may be. But I think there's so much productive labor to be done that I think we could get something in exchange for that from the majority of people.
Great, thank you.
So to wrap up where I'm going, if we think about sort of the golden age of the post-war period, and then we think about those hard hat revolts, and then the mixture of the white working class vote sort of fragmenting, I bring you to argument 6, or the last of my arguments, and what I'm calling the politics of despair. And this is a quote from Barack Obama. He got caught on a hot mic, and he in a private event, and then he was vilified for it. It was actually really, it was regarded as a condescending statement, but I actually think it was pretty good. He said, you go into these small towns in Pennsylvania, and like a lot of small towns in the Midwest, the jobs have been gone now for 25 years, and nothing's replaced them. And they fell through the Clinton administration and the Bush administration. And each successive administration has said that somehow these communities are going to regenerate, and they have not. And it's not surprising when they get bitter. They cling to guns or religion or antipathy toward people that aren't like them, or anti-immigrant sentiment or anti-trade sentiment as a way to explain their frustrations. And I don't think Obama was able to do much either in that regard. This was 2008 for a variety of reasons, and I could, if anybody wants to talk about that, I'd be happy to. But what that leads us with is now what these so-called deaths of despair that these two economists, Case and Deaton, have shown, in which people are dying of highly preventable diseases essentially because of their own lack of faith in their capacity and their place in the world. And what's interesting, and again, one of my excuses for studying white working class people is that they're the ones who are having these deaths of despair, alcohol and drug and suicide, mostly middle-aged white men. And we've actually seen a reversal of life expectancy for them. It's the life expectancy of this demographic is going down. And on the one hand, it's always been better than it has been for minorities. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And you can ask the question, who gets to get despair, right? You only get despair if you're falling from a certain position. But there is a sense that this group feels is a particularly culturally powerful group, I think, in the sense that what they do can have tremendous impact on politics. And it is a dangerous and in some ways volatile group. And so I find this sort of symptom of what's going on to be quite horrifying, actually. And then back to the technological question, in case one of the authors of the Deaths of Despair studies says European countries have faced the same kind of technological change we have, and they're not seeing the people killing themselves with guns or drugs or alcohol. There's something unique about the way the U.S. is handling this. And I want to go back to the sense of fragmentation since the post-war era, when the U.S. had this sort of more social democratic tinge because of this sort of increased homogeneity that was short-lived. So I'm going to end. My last slide is a long text, but I think it's sort of telling. This is from one of my favorite philosophers, a guy named Richard Rorty, who wrote in 1998. So this is 98. This is late Clinton administration. And I find it remarkably prescient for our own time. And he says, members of labor unions and unorganized, unskilled workers will sooner or later realize that their government is not even trying to prevent wages from sinking or to prevent jobs from being exported. Around the same time, they will realize that suburban white-collar workers, themselves desperately afraid of being downsized, are not going to let themselves be taxed to provide social benefits for anyone else. At that point, something will crack. The non-suburban electorate will decide that the system has failed and start looking around for a strong man to vote for. Someone willing to assure them that once he is elected, the smug bureaucrats and the tricky lawyers, overpaid bond salesmen, and postmodern professors will no longer be calling the shots. One thing that is very likely to happen is that the gains made in the past 40 years by Black and brown Americans and by homosexuals will be wiped out. Jocular contempt for women will come back in fashion. And all the resentment which badly educated Americans feel about having their manners dictated to them by college graduates will find an outlet. It took another 18 years, but I think that strongman emerged, and I think that he is a product of all of these changes that we have been looking at in the politics and economics of inequality. And if I seem to have lost you. Andy? Hello? Okay. Anybody out there? There we go. Am I alone?
Hey, Jeff.
Whoa, hey, there you go.
Hey, I'm sorry about that. I totally lost my internet.
Oh, okay.
I'm back. It's one of the, you know what? All these times of doing webinars weekly for years, that's rarely happened, but tonight I dropped my internet. So I dropped out when you were reading the first paragraph.
Okay, okay. Well,
but it looks like everybody else could hear you. Joel,
Oh,
Daisy,
okay.
Teresa, Jay, Amelia, these folks all could hear you, so or at least respond. So thank you for being patient.
No problem, no problem. Anyway, the idea that this was just oh, now all my clicks are going to come back. The idea that this was sort of foreseeable, that it's not a mystery where all of this sort of backlash sentiment came from, I think, is sort of my take home with the Richard Rorty quote here, in which he predicts Donald Trump, I think, almost to a T. So the ideas I've given you here sort of more or less come from these two of my books listed here. The first one is Staying Alive, the History of the 1970s and the Last Days of the Working Class, which has lots more about rock and roll and country music and movies and things like that, in addition to the dry stuff. And then The Great Exception, which is the idea that the post-war era was a unique period. So, but with that, I would welcome any further questions anybody has.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jeff. I really do appreciate you sharing your presentation tonight. I'm going to scroll back as we're waiting just to make sure I didn't miss any of the comments. If anybody has any last questions, please do type them into the chat box. We'd love to entertain a few last comments.
Yeah, the questions have been great. I mean, I'm looking at my list.
It's really been fantastic. And
everything
this is
from
also
automation to UBI to the third party.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm going to, as folks are flexing their fingers to type in their last questions, I'll also pitch. I have not released yet next year's webinar series, but your colleague Bob Talisi in the philosophy department will be working with us on polarization of politics.
Oh, great. A pragmatist philosopher. That's good.
Yeah.
Speaking of Rorty, actually, I bet you'll get some more Richard Rorty from him.
I likely will. Any last questions for Dr. Cowie before we close the night? Any final questions? So I'm going to ask you one final question then before we move on, and that is, you know, I look at the image that you've got here. It's the cover of, it was the initial slide that you led with. It's the cover of your book. When you look at the individuals in this image, now I'm asking you this is all just speculation, it's interpretation as an historian. Right. I'm drawn, I mean, there's one face I'm drawn to, and it's not the big guy in the middle hollering with the flag. It's the little girl, right? Underneath the microphone.
Yeah.
Tell us, can you talk just a little bit about this may be a question about generations, it may be a question about sort of the ways that we grow up in inequality and the expectations we have. But how do you see the current generation of students you work with in terms of responding to the issues of 2020? And so I'll sum this up with Brennan's question. Are we in an equality crisis now?
Absolutely. I think it is. I personally, like, this is my own views, less my views as a professional historian. But I think the two major problems we face are inequality and climate change. And I think we've put the questions of economic inequality in the back burner for so long, so many decades, and kicked what the state can do, kicked it around for so long that it can't work anymore. And I think we're finding out the pitfalls of both of those problems. The efficacy of the state and the debilitating nature of inequality in the midst of this crisis right now. So yeah, that I think that's it, and my students do too. My students are quite concerned with it, and it's funny you should point to that little girl, because I've been fascinated by her too. I'd love to track her down, because that was probably about the age I was, I'm guessing. And to me at that time, everything was just so confusing. You know, there's just so many different crises and problems. And I remember just one little anecdote. I remember my sister had a boyfriend come over and he had long hair and a beard, but he was wearing a suit, and I could not make sense of how there weren't hippies in suits. I didn't understand that you could do that. But in terms of my own students, they are very concerned about this, and I think you see expressions of this concern in both parties. I think I think in some ways the Trump phenomenon is an expression of this worry of both decline and inequality. I think you see it with the Elizabeth Warren campaign, with the Bernie Sanders campaign. The Democratic Party has pushed left in the last 4 years more than it has been probably since the 70s. So I think there's a lot of churn going on, and my students are absolutely fascinated and curious to know the long history of these problems. And they're especially interested in the politics of the state. Like, wait, how does the state play a role in all this? How does it, when is it redistributed well? Why, what types of economies create more equitable distributions of wealth? Can this happen naturally within a free market economy? Does it require state intervention? They're really quite taken by these questions.
Yeah, I agree. I think the kids, this generation, my daughter's in college. I suspect many of the students that our audience tonight teaches, they're very, very concerned, dialed in, and interested in ways to respond to that. So hopefully tonight's session will be some material that the teachers with us tonight can share and continue this conversation. Jeff, thank you so much.
They're really smart too. Those kids are really great.
That's right.
So, well, thank you all for paying attention, and I really enjoyed this, and hope it was of some value. And thanks for being teachers.
Great. I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. Please do follow the National Humanities Center on our social media. Facebook and Twitter is the best way to get notice of upcoming opportunities and events and programs. Please also go to our website and sign up for our email listserv. That's a good way to see any new things we have coming. Our next webinar is scheduled for next Tuesday, April the 21st. We'll be working with past fellow Akram Khader. He's a professor of history at North Carolina State University, just down the road in Raleigh. And the topic will be understanding the modern Middle East. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Please be well, be safe. Have a great day in your virtual school tomorrow. We hope to see you next time with the National Humanities Center and our Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night, everyone.